Hello, and welcome to our fourth whiskey tasting session. It's great to have you here with us again. So, have there been any drinks in particular you found to be good recently? I see. Been sticking to the favourites, but you're looking to branch out and try a few more bourbon whiskies? Oh, very good. So, for this whiskey tasting session today, the only thing that these whiskies you'll be trying today have in common is that I believe, yes, they are all bourbons. However, each of these bourbons have their own distinct distillation process and unique flavour combination and process of creating that flavour. So this will be a really interesting whiskey tasting session. For this whiskey tasting session today, we have 5 bourbons for you to try, starting from left to right again. We do now offer ice and whiskey stones that you can feel free to add to each of the whiskey samplers for a different experience with the whiskies, should you wish to. So let's have a look at the bourbons that you'll be trying this time. Firstly, we will begin with a brand new bourbon that we have not sampled yet. This is the Four Roses Small Batch Bourbon. We will then be moving on to the Bulleit 90 proof Bourbon High Rye Whiskey. After that, we will then be moving on to Maker's Mark 46, which is this one right here. I believe you tried Maker's Mark, the original, in the previous whiskey tasting. Okay, we will then be moving on to the Jim Beam Single Barrel Bourbon, which is at 108 proof. And then to finish off, we have a very, very special bourbon that we would love to share with you today, and that is the Cask Strength Maker's Mark, which is bottled at 109 proof. This is a very, very special whiskey bourbon, and I'll tell you all about it a little later on. But for now, if you just like to sit back and relax, and feel free to try the whiskies along with me. Okay, and of course, as always, you can feel free to try the whiskey in totality or skip it, whatever you feel comfortable with. Okay, so firstly, we are going to begin with the Four Roses Small Batch Bourbon. This is a 90 proof bourbon, so it's slightly on the stronger end, and you'll notice today there is a slight bit more of a theme of higher proof bourbons. I believe our weakest today is going to be 90, which is the Four Roses and Bulleit, and it will be going up all the way to 109 proof, which is the final one today. This one is 108, and I believe that this one is 94, so fairly heavy spirits. But the reason that we've chosen these specific bourbons for your fourth whiskey tasting session is that by now you've become accustomed to the strength and proof of many whiskies, and your palate should look far beyond the taste of just strong alcohol, and you'll be able to discover some more complex flavours as you go higher up in proof. Certainly not whiskies I would encourage for beginners, but because this is your fourth tasting session with us, I think that you may find these suitable. Okay, so let's learn a little bit more about Four Roses. So this is distilled in Lawrenceburg, Kentucky, and whilst there is no specific aging on this whiskey, we estimate from the colour and how whiskies are typically aged when it comes to bourbons, this is approximately 6 to 7 years aged. This whiskey is pretty interesting, and you can feel free to begin having a look at this one or a sniff of it should you wish. This one is pretty interesting because it does use 2 mixes of mash bills. So this uses a combination of the first mash bill, which is 60% corn, 35% rye, 5% barley. And with that, it combines the mash bill of 75% corn, 20% rye, and 5% barley, as well as all 5 different yeast strains. Four Roses likes to experiment a little bit with mash bills to create some unique flavour combinations for each of their specific sold Four Roses spirits, which includes the famous Four Roses Yellow Spirit. So 4 of Four Roses' 10 recipes are mingled together to create this drink, so there are going to be lots of different flavours. And for that reason, this drink is quite complex, but it's also a very personal drink, and the scents and taste that you pick up on might differentiate to how I personally feel on the drink. It's all open to interpretation. But the wonderful part about it is that every time you open the bottle and let it air out a little bit, the flavours it produces are just a slightly bit different each time you consume this particular spirit. The 4 flavours used for this Four Roses small batch bourbon are some of the most desirable flavours for whiskey enthusiasts. They include fruit and spice notes throughout. Four Roses small batch bourbon is charred for 45 seconds, which is a fairly typical charring for a bourbon, and that puts that somewhere between the level 3 and 4 for charring. So now let's go to the scent for this one. You'll notice a delicious, beautiful amber colour to this one. There is oak and citrus, fruit, and just a joyful hint of spice. And nestled beneath that as you swirl, there is a layer of caramel. The scent isn't distinctly unique to bourbons. It uses all of the classic scents. The scent is light and beginner welcoming for that reason, but only for that reason alone. You agree? Good. Now, as you may have noticed, as I discussed with the mash bill, this is a high rye whiskey, so the scent from this one, whilst different, does still fall into the family of rye whiskies. So it's unique in that regard, but it does match with other rye whiskey scents. Some at least. It's a very welcoming, a very embraced scent, very joyful. So now let's try this one, however you please, whether it's straight or on the rocks or with whiskey stones, whichever you prefer. Creamy consistency, delightful. This might be one of the higher rye whiskies we have introduced to you, so I'll be quite curious to see how this one fares with you and what you think about it. There is a perfect balance, though, of different flavours. Whatever you might not consider unique in the scent of this one is cast aside by the beautiful, delicate, personal and unique scents and unique flavours from the palate on this one. There are cherries, light oak, summer fruit, and when chewed, there's caramel and that just utterly gorgeous rye spice. There is not a standout flavour from the initial tasting on this one, and I do believe you have to wait until the finish on this particular bourbon whiskey to fully embrace a couple more of those flavours. So you may be picking up on that now. It has a very long finish, and it's a little bit more complex on the finish for this one. It does take time to identify the more delicate flavours here, but the cherry and the seasoned oak really shine through at the end here. A nice long finish, and that creamy consistency is very much welcomed on the way down. It's very, very pleasant. You like this one? Very good. I was unsure what you might think of this one, given the high rye content and the unique flavour mash bills of this one. Good, I'm glad you like this one. So now we're going to be moving on to Bulleit's 90 proof straight bourbon high rye whiskey. Whilst this does consider itself a high rye whiskey, this does not have as much rye in it as Four Roses. So I'll quickly show you the bottle for this one. And this has a mash bill of 68% corn, 28% rye and 4% barley, so 7% less rye than the previous spirit you drank. It is aged for an unspecified amount of time, but we do approximate again 6 years on this one. So this is a fairly new bourbon on the shelves. Whilst the original bourbon for this one isn't new, this one itself is new. So the new recipe for this one, which was officially released to customers, was released in 1987 by the great-great-grandson of the original owner, Augustus Bulleit. So that is where the name comes from. However, the original recipe does date back all the way to approximately 1830, and the recipe for this one does not at all match the original one. The original mash bill for this one was 2/3 rye and 1/3 corn, which was very much a high rye whiskey, as opposed to the opposite today. This is more marketed as a mixing bourbon. High rye whiskies are very lovely mixed. So this company is owned by Diageo, or Diageo, however you wish to pronounce it, and it's distilled in Shelbyville, Kentucky, as of 2019. Four Roses, the first drink you try today, was the original distiller of this one. It has now officially moved into its own distillery as of 2019. So now let's try this one, beginning with the scent. For the scent of this one, there appears to be equal amounts of vanilla, caramel, and one big hefty breath in brings in orange to complement the balance there. There are notes beneath it though, and when swirled they come out as tame notes of smoke, cherry, and oak. The aromas on this one are rich, plentiful. They really do make full use of the 90 proof on this one. This is fairly straightforward as a scent. And I believe that's about as much as I can personally identify, but what do you think in regards to the scent of this one? Interesting, interesting. Well, let's give this one a go now and see what you think of the taste. Opens immediately with sweet caramel. It becomes focused on a strong peppered oak. You don't even need to chew for the peppered oak to come through. It already lingers and sticks in between your teeth and right to your tongue. However, despite that, the mouthfeel is both creamy and light, which is impressive considering creaminess is more associated with being more of a thicker consistency. But to create that balance, I think, is very impressive. The flavours here: simple, true, and distinct pepper, oak, and ginger. Very much like the scent on this one. For this very reason, this could be considered branching into the just a step above a beginner when it comes to whiskey consumption. spice begins and ends with this one. It almost takes over some of the more delicate and refined flavours, such as the ginger. But it is a welcome taste in there. I'm glad that I can taste it. The finish on this one continues to be spice and pepper and oak, completely dominates. However, let it settle for just a little bit longer, and you'll notice there's some butterscotch. It's quite tasty when you just let it sit there for a while. You almost have to let it work itself instead of you work the drink. And as it settles into your taste buds, those more delicate flavours do arise themselves. So there's a lengthy finish on this one. It's warm, it's moody, but it's charming. It's a very embraced drink. I very much enjoyed this one. What do you think? Good, good. That's a very interesting take. So now we're going to be moving on to the Jim Beam Single Barrel 108 Proof Straight Bourbon Whiskey. You ready for this one? Okay. So I believe the highest proof you have tried at our whiskey tasting sessions prior to this one today, I believe was the Wild Turkey 101 proof. What did you think of that one? Okay. The mash bill makeup of that one is slightly different, so you will be getting a little bit of a more unique drink with this one. Now I believe you have tried Jim Beam's Double Cut with us in a previous whiskey tasting session. Now remind me, what did you think of that one? Okay. To keep the experience here at the whiskey tasting sessions unique, those two drinks are actually quite different to one another, and this one has a completely unique flavour profile to it as opposed to the Devil's Cut. You will be getting a unique experience. So, for this one, there is no age specification, but again, we can approximate about 6 years given the colour of it and the typical aging of bourbons. This particular whiskey is the highest ABV branded release from Jim Beam, and this is their first release of a single barrel whiskey, which means instead of combining the flavours from different batches or different barrels, you'll be getting it exactly from one barrel. Some people tend to prefer that. So this is a very unique approach from Jim Beam, and the design of this one was updated in 2019, and this complements the already existing 95 proof from Jim Beam. However, for those who are looking for a little bit more strength and richness and depth to their spirits, should consider this one, especially at the price point, and the proof of this one is quite impressive for that reason. This is, of course, distilled at the Jim Beam Bourbon Distillery. And now let's have a look at this one, starting with the scent. Scents of honey on this one, on the initial scent. Dried orange, linger, apple, licorice, fennel. And that's one of the charming parts of a higher proof whiskey. It's not simply just stronger bourbon or stronger whiskey. There's a considerably larger amount of flavours you'll begin to identify through these bourbons at that proof, and I find that to be quite interesting. Bringing in a more deeper scent on this one, candied pineapple very much comes through. And when you swirl, there's a richness here. It really almost ignites those previous scents of apple. And it really washes through vanilla, the baked apples. And by swirling, there's a little bit more focus on the fennel here. And there are just slight tinges of clove and cinnamon. The scent profile of this one is certainly complex, and it's a very fun one. This is a much more fruity scent than a lot of the other Jim Beam releases. So, are you ready to try this one? Okay, so give this one some time to settle into your palate just because this is slightly higher proof. Okay. Rich honey and orange just flow through here. Just a wonderful initial tasting on this one. Quickly followed by herbal notes and oak. The taste is actually reminiscent, if you've tried this, of Knob Creek's 9-year bourbon. Quite similar. And that licorice that could be identified through smelling it is definitely present in the taste here. And I like that because licorice doesn't often come up with bourbons or whiskies. I appreciate it. After you chew on this one, it becomes a medium finish, and there's a little bit more emphasis on some of the more nutty flavours of this spirit. The finish focuses on the orange peel, the pineapple, with roasted oak and smoke. It's warming, it's lingering. And despite the high proof, not overbearing, and not a particular emphasis on the taste of just pure alcohol. It's flavourful. It's interesting. What do you think of this one? Especially considering this is the highest proof whiskey you've tried at our sessions. That's a very interesting take. That's very interesting. That's very interesting. Okay, well now let's move on to the 2 Maker's Mark spirits that we have for this tasting session today. So we're first going to begin with this Maker's Mark here. This is Maker's Mark 46, and this is a 94 proof Kentucky bourbon distilled in Loretto, Kentucky. Now, whilst you did try the original makers in our previous whiskey tasting session, I didn't go into too much detail about the history of makers, but I would very much like to before we begin this one today because it's quite interesting how this drink came about. So before we begin, the mash bill of this one is identical to the original 46 and the cask strength here today, but the flavour profiles and the way you identify those flavours and the scent of these are unique. So this one's mash bill is 70% corn, 16% red winter wheat, and 14% barley. And I'll discuss today a little bit more about why wheat was used as opposed to rye, because as you may have noticed, this whiskey lacks any rye at all. And that's what makes for a very unique tasting, not only for the original, but the 46, the cask strength, as well as the other additions. So Samuels Sr., Bill Samuels Sr., purchased the original distillery in the 1950s. And he immediately set to work on creating a brand new flavour profile because he despised the taste of the original whiskey from the farm there. He decided that the best overall recipe was to be decided upon by making different loaves of bread out of different recipe makeups. He decided in the end that the tastiest loaf of bread lacked any rye at all. So that's why sometimes when you taste this one, there is almost a taste of a loaf of wheat bread, believe it or not. Him and his wife made the whiskey together in the oven instead of a still, which I find to be quite charming. And his lovely wife decided to suggest dipping the bottles in red wax, and that has made for the iconic look on each bottle. So the biggest difference between Maker's Mark 46 and the original is the aging process and the staves used. So Maker's Mark 46 is aged for a fair bit longer than the original, and they also include French staves in the aging process. The French staves are added 2 to 3 months before the drink has finished aging in the barrel, and that adds some more flavours to the initial flavour profile of the spirit. So Maker's Mark 46 was actually the second major release from the Maker's Mark brand in 2010, and that was actually from Bill Samuels Sr.'s son, Bill Samuels Jr., which I think is a quite nice homage to the family name by creating the first drink in over 50 years for the brand. The reason it's called Maker's Mark 46 is that was the flavour profile used. It doesn't really have anything to do with the amount of staves or flavours. It's just the flavour profile in the end for it. So now, let's have a smell on this one. Typical Maker's profile here. In the stunning deep amber colour to the spirit of that one. The colour of the 46 is actually a bit darker, a bit slightly more on the true burnt amber side to the cask strength, interestingly. You'd almost expect the cask strength to be a little on the deeper side for colours. So there is a twist on the traditional Maker's profile here. Classic bourbon flavours are present: vanilla, caramel, toasted oak, buttery toffee. Buttery toffee is I always associate that with Maker's. And that's about the scent profile on this one. But there's depth to each of those scents. And whilst rye focuses on spice, there's not really a lot of spice here because there's no rye. So let's try this one. Immediately buttery, very much likewise to the scent. And because this one has been aged for a little bit longer, those flavours are a little bit more deep, a little bit more rich. Palate very much welcomes that though. Heavy oak, caramel, slight cinnamon to this one. With, as I mentioned before, yes, the flavours of a traditional wheat bread. You can taste that, yes. The flavours here, not as deep as the nose, which was extremely impressive to get all of that out of the scent on that one, and to get those very simple flavours separated from each other. But still, this is balanced and charming. Definitely for those who prefer a much almost sweeter, buttery, more creamy whiskey. So the finish on this one does tend to emphasise tobacco and leather. However, the finish of this one is really interesting when you let it just settle. You might need to assist it with some chewing on this one, and as it really nestles in between your teeth and mingles between your taste buds, it has a short finish, but buttered rum does come through if you let it, or if you work with it. Abrupt finish, smooth finish, but that's about what I can decipher from it. What do you think? Okay, very interesting. Okay, so now we will be moving on to the final bourbon for this whiskey tasting session today. However, I do believe that this is the most special whiskey you will have tried thus far at our whiskey tasting sessions. So this is the Maker's Mark at cask strength, and this is always bottled between 108 and 114 proof. This one is bottled at just over 109 proof, and as you can see, the batch is marked on the front, so you know what batch you got exactly for a little bit more of a personal touch to the drink. So before we begin on this one, a little bit more information about Maker's Mark. Having a high wheat whiskey is quite rare in the world of whiskies and bourbons. There are a few who make whiskies that are high wheat whiskies. Two of note are Pappy Van Winkle and Weller, as well as Maker's Mark. So it's very interesting to see them infuse themselves into the wheat market. It's always nice to try something a little bit different. So, just to let you know, as you begin smelling this one, the biggest difference is that you are getting it as more of an authentic taste, and you're getting it straight out of the barrel. The wish and hope from the company with this specific cask strength Maker's bourbon was that it would be like taking a glass out of the barrel directly and sipping away. And that's what they mean by cask strength. So the initial scent here is quite piney, with some maple syrup. There is vanilla, there is dried orange, there is apple, and there is that light cinnamon again. But lovely enough, when you bottle this at that higher proof, there are just slightly other flavours that come out, such as sourness from the cherry, as opposed to just tartness from the cherry. When swirled, however, it's packed with sweetness, brown sugar, vanilla, peaches, graham crackers. So now let's try this one. I believe that this is the highest proof bourbon whiskey we have invited you to try here today, so I do hope that you enjoy it, but of course, be honest, no hurt feelings here. And despite that lack of rye, sweet cinnamon seems to be in full force here, followed by these lovely gentle swirls of wheat grain, honey. It's just a complete triumph of the spirit. There are light dashes of vanilla, which is good. Vanilla can be welcomed, but slightly repetitive in the world of bourbon whiskey, so I appreciate that it is there, because it would feel slightly peculiar if it was not, but I appreciate that it's taken almost a little bit of back seat to those more interesting flavours. Despite the really high proof of this particular bourbon, there are so many light, gentle, delicate flavours that are just flowing through this one. The orange and the apple from the initial scent on this one. There is certainly a flash of heat, however, on the finish of this one. Light oak, just gently resting on the heat of that. And that is anticipated. It is a high proof whiskey. If it didn't come with any heat, I would honestly be quite concerned. But the flavour combinations here of dry oak, cinnamon, and honey are extremely complementary, and that heat at the end is not absent. It definitely comes with the honey and the oak right at the end there. So, what did you think of the Maker's Cask Strength? Okay. Well, as always, it has been wonderful to have you here to join us at our whiskey tasting sessions. We hope you've found something enjoyable out of this whiskey tasting session today, and we look forward to seeing you again in the future. Take care. Goodbye.